I hit send at 11:47 p.m. and immediately wanted to throw my laptop out the window. 3 years of Sam treating me like his personal assistant/emotional punching bag, and I finally did it. I quit via email. Not exactly professional, but neither was him screaming at me in front of the entire marketing team today over a presentation that wasn't even my responsibility. My hands were still shaking as I stared at the screen. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position. Please consider this my formal notice. Jack. Short, sweet, and probably career suicide, but I couldn't take another day of his mood swings and impossible demands. The cursor blinked mockingly at me, as if questioning whether I'd really gone through with it. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing. Sam Donovan's 6 feet of perfectly pressed suits and sharp jawlines that made every woman in the office forget he was a complete nightmare to work for. Everyone thought he was some kind of business genius, the golden boy who'd transformed his father's struggling company into a market leader. But I knew better. I'd seen the real Sam, the one who stayed until 2 a.m. reviewing every single detail, running his hands through his dark hair like he was carrying the weight of the entire world. Not my problem anymore, or so I kept telling myself. The apartment felt different now that I was officially unemployed. The IKEA furniture I'd bought with my first paycheck suddenly looked cheap and temporary. The motivational poster on my wall, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal," now seemed like a cruel joke. I'd been so proud when I got this job, fresh out of college with big dreams and bigger debts. Sam's company was prestigious, the kind of place that looked impressive on a resume. I remember my first day. Sam had barely looked at me during the introduction, just nodded curtly when HR explained I'd be working directly under him on the Morrison account. I thought he was just busy, focused, professional. I had no idea that his cold demeanor would become the bane of my existence for the next 3 years. The Morrison account. That's where it all started going wrong. I'd worked 60-hour weeks, skipped family dinners, canceled dates, all to make sure every detail was perfect. And when we landed the contract, worth $12 million, Sam took all the credit in the board meeting. Didn't even mention my name. I sat there in that glass conference room, watching him present my research, my strategies, my late-night brainstorming sessions, like they were his own brilliant ideas. That should have been my first red flag. But I was young, eager to prove myself, convinced that if I just worked harder he'd eventually notice my contributions. What a fucking joke. I was halfway through my second beer when someone started pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding, like the building was on fire and they needed to evacuate immediately. The clock on my microwave read 12:15 a.m. Who the hell shows up at someone's apartment after midnight? My first thought was Mrs. Chen from 4B. She'd been having issues with her ex-husband lately, and maybe he'd shown up drunk again. But the pounding was too aggressive, too desperate. This wasn't some domestic dispute. This was someone who was barely holding it together. I set my beer down and walked to the peephole, my heart already starting to race for reasons I couldn't explain. The hallway light was dim, casting shadows that made it hard to see clearly. But when the figure moved slightly to the left, I got a clear view of his face. My heart literally stopped. Sam. At midnight, outside my apartment. His usually perfect tie was loosened, hanging askew around his neck. His shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled up in a way I'd never seen in the office. His hair, always perfectly styled, was disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it obsessively. He looked like he'd driven straight here without stopping, without thinking, without caring about anything except getting to my door. "Jack." His voice came through the door, slightly hoarse, raw with an emotion I couldn't identify. "I know you're in there. Open the damn door." I'd never heard him say my name like that. In the office it was always clipped, professional, usually followed by some impossible task or criticism about my work. But this was different. There was something almost pleading in his tone, something that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. My heart was beating so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear it. This was the same man who couldn't be bothered to make eye contact with me unless there was urgent work to discuss. The same man who'd humiliated me in front of our colleagues just hours ago. What was he doing here? What could possibly be so important that it couldn't wait until Monday morning? "We need to talk," he said again, and this time I could hear something else in his voice. Desperation? anger, or something else entirely that I wasn't prepared for, something that made my stomach flip in ways I didn't want to analyze. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. Through the thin wood I could hear him moving, probably pacing the narrow hallway like he did in his office when he was stressed about a deadline. The same restless energy that I'd watched from across conference tables for 3 years was now just inches away from me. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him stand out there until he gave up and went home. I owed him nothing, less than nothing considering how he treated me. But another part of me, a part I really didn't want to examine too closely, was curious. What could Sam Donovan possibly want from me at midnight that couldn't wait for business hours? "Jack, please." His voice was softer now, almost vulnerable, and that single word made my resolve crumble. I'd never heard him say please to anyone, not in 3 years of working for him. He gave orders, made demands, expected compliance. He didn't ask politely for anything. I took a deep breath, knowing instinctively that whatever happened next would change everything between us. The Jack who opened this door wouldn't be the same Jack who'd sent that resignation email 2 hours ago. Something fundamental was shifting, and I could feel it in the way my hands trembled as I reached for the deadbolt. The hallway was about to become a battleground, and I had no idea which one of us would walk away intact. But I opened the door anyway. The moment I opened the door, Sam pushed past me like he owned the place. His cologne, sandalwood mixed with something purely masculine that I'd never been close enough to identify, filled my entire living room. I'd never noticed how intimidating his physical presence was until he was invading my personal space, making my modest apartment feel impossibly small. "Are you out of your fucking mind?" He whirled around to face me, and I saw something in his hazel eyes that I'd never witnessed before. Vulnerability mixed with barely controlled anger. "Email? Seriously, Jack? After 3 years you send me a goddamn email?" I'd never heard him curse before. Sam was always controlled, polished, the epitome of corporate professionalism. This rawness was completely foreign territory, and it was throwing me off balance in ways I couldn't process. "It was professional," I managed to say, though my voice was shaking because he was standing way too close, close enough that I could see the 5 o'clock shadow he usually kept meticulously groomed. And it saved us both from wasting time on explanations. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a bitter sound that made my chest tighten. "Professional? Jack, do you know what I was doing when your email came through?" I was finishing the Johnson contract at 11:30 p.m., that massive project that only you can handle properly, because you're the only one who actually understands their technical requirements and their company culture. Someone else can take over. No one else can do what you do. His voice rose, echoing off my apartment walls, and then he suddenly stopped, as if realizing he was losing control. He ran his hand through his hair, that gesture I'd watched from across conference rooms 1,000 times when he was stressed about quarterly reports or difficult clients. "Jack, you don't understand what you're doing to me." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the sound of my wall clock ticking and both of us breathing harder than we should have been. I studied his face, trying to figure out what exactly was happening here. Sam Donovan, who never crossed personal boundaries, who treated every interaction like a business transaction, was standing in my apartment at midnight looking completely broken. His perfectly ironed shirt was wrinkled from what looked like hours of anxious movement. His tie, usually knotted with mathematical precision, hung loose around his neck. Even his shoes, Italian leather that probably cost more than my monthly rent, were scuffed, like he'd run to his car without caring about anything except getting here. "What don't I understand?" I asked carefully, because something in his demeanor was making me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. He moved closer, dangerously close, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to hear the slight irregularity in his breathing. "That I can't function without you. That I can't even breathe properly in that office when you're not there." The words came out cracked, vulnerable, and he immediately followed them by reaching for my wrist, gripping it gently but firmly. I realized my hands were shaking again, and his touch somehow made it worse and better at the same time. "Sam, are you drunk?" I whispered. "'Cause this couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same man who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years. "Stone cold sober," he replied, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. And maybe for the first time in 3 years, I'm thinking clearly about what I actually want. The heating in my apartment was working perfectly, but suddenly the temperature felt suffocating. His fingers were still wrapped around my wrist and I could feel his pulse through his thumb, fast and irregular, matching my own racing heart. 3 years, Jack. His voice was getting softer, more intimate, and I found myself leaning in despite every rational thought telling me to step back. 3 years I've been watching you, working alongside you, watching your brilliant mind solve problems that stumped everyone else in the company. And I never what? I prompted, though my own voice was barely audible. He looked directly into my eyes, and the intensity there made my knees actually weak. Never told you what you mean to me. Personally, the words hit my system like an earthquake. I wanted to say something smart, something defensive, something that would protect me from whatever this was becoming. But I had literally no words, just his hand on my wrist, my heart beating dangerously fast, and the dawning realization that everything I thought I knew about my boss was completely wrong. Sam, you're confused. It's the stress or company pressure or… I'm not confused, he interrupted, stepping even closer. Now there were barely inches between us, and I could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could count his eyelashes if I wanted to. I've been confused for the past 3 years, watching you walk into the office every morning, sitting next to you in meetings, hearing you laugh when you talked with other colleagues. I got jealous, Jack. Fucking jealous whenever someone else got your attention. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't the Sam Donovan I knew, the man who never showed personal emotions, who handled every interaction like a business transaction with predetermined outcomes. Then why didn't you fire me? If I was such a distraction, I managed to ask. He released my wrist and touched my jaw instead, so gently that I involuntarily leaned into his touch before I could stop myself. The contact sent electricity through my entire nervous system, because you were perfect for me. Without you, I felt incomplete in the office during presentations when making major decisions. I thought if I maintained professional distance, set clear boundaries, this feeling would eventually fade away. But it didn't, not even close. It got worse, actually, especially today when you looked at me in the office after I lost my temper with the team. The disappointment in your eyes, the hurt. I realized that I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of facing whatever this is between us. My brain was completely short-circuiting. This was the same man who'd barely acknowledged my contributions for 3 years, who'd ignored my suggestions in meetings when they didn't align with his predetermined agenda. Sam, I started, but he was so close to my lips that the words got stuck in my throat. I could feel his breath on my face, warm and slightly unsteady. The space between us was charged with 3 years of unspoken tension, misunderstood glances, and professional interactions that suddenly seemed loaded with completely different meaning. My apartment had become a pressure cooker and we were both about to explode. 3 years, Jack. 3 years I've been watching you, working with you, appreciating your intelligence, your creativity, your dedication, and I never… Sam's voice trailed off like he was searching for words that didn't exist in any corporate handbook. Never what? I prompted, though my own voice was barely a whisper because the intensity in his eyes was making it hard to breathe normally. He looked directly at me and the raw emotion there made my knees actually weak. Never told you that you mean everything to me. Not just professionally, personally, completely. Sam's words hit my nervous system like lightning. I wanted to say something intelligent, something that would deflect this moment and protect me from whatever was happening here. But I was completely speechless. There was just his hand on my face, my heart beating like it was trying to escape my chest, and this earth-shattering realization that everything I thought I understood about our relationship was built on completely false assumptions. Sam, you're overwhelmed. It's the stress from today or pressure from the board. Or… I'm not overwhelmed, he interrupted, moving even closer until there was barely any space between us. I've been overwhelmed for the past 3 years, watching you arrive at the office every morning in those perfectly pressed shirts, sitting next to you during budget meetings and trying not to notice how you bite your lip when you're concentrating, hearing you laugh during coffee breaks with other departments. I got jealous, Jack, pathetically, irrationally jealous whenever someone else made you smile. This couldn't be real. This wasn't the Sam Donovan I knew. The man who'd never shown personal emotions in my presence, who treated every workplace interaction like a calculated business move with measurable outcomes. Then why didn't you just fire me? If I was causing you such complications? I somehow managed to ask through my confusion. He moved his hand from my jaw to cup my face properly, his thumb tracing my cheekbone so gently that I found myself leaning into the touch before my brain could override the impulse. Because you were exactly what I needed, Jack. Without you handling the technical aspects of major accounts, managing client relationships, anticipating problems before they became crises, I felt incomplete. During presentations, strategy meetings, crisis management, everything was better when you were involved. I thought if I maintained strict professional boundaries, kept our interactions purely business-focused, these feelings would eventually disappear. But they didn't disappear. They got stronger, much stronger. Especially today when you looked at me after I lost control in front of the team. The disappointment in your eyes, the hurt, the way you just shut down. I realized I'm more terrified of losing you than I am of confronting whatever this connection is between us. My brain was trying to process information that contradicted 3 years of evidence. This was the same man who'd taken credit for my work on the Morrison account, who'd dismissed my suggestions during quarterly reviews, who'd made me feel invisible and undervalued for years. Sam, I started to say, but he was positioned so close to my mouth that words became impossible. I could feel his breath against my lips, could see the slight tremor in his hands as he held my face. I know this is complicated as hell, Sam continued, his voice dropping to something intimate and desperate. I know I'm your boss, that there are company policies and power dynamics and ethical considerations. I know this probably seems completely inappropriate and potentially career-damaging for both of us. But Jack, his voice became almost a whisper. I can't let you walk away. Not without at least trying to show you what you actually mean to me. Show me how. I asked, though deep down I already knew where this conversation was heading. Could feel it in the way the air between us had become electric. Like this, he said, and then he kissed me. It started soft and tentative, like he was asking for permission, testing whether I'd pull away or push him back or tell him to leave. But when I responded because I literally couldn't help myself after 3 years of buried attraction, it became deeper, more urgent, more desperate. His mouth was warm and tasted faintly of coffee and something that was purely Sam. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer against him, and I realized I was gripping his shirt like it was the only thing keeping me upright. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, foreheads touching, neither of us willing to move away and break the spell. Fuck, I whispered, my voice shaky. Sam, what have you just done? Something I've wanted to do for 3 years, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Every morning when you walked into staff meetings, every time you presented solutions that saved us thousands of dollars, every time you stayed late to perfect a proposal that made me look good to the board. Wait, I said, suddenly processing something he'd mentioned earlier. You deliberately didn't give me credit for my work? Sam looked guilty, his hands still resting on my waist. I was protective of you, but also selfish. I didn't want upper management to notice your talents too much and decide to transfer you to a different department or promote you to a position where you wouldn't be working directly with me anymore. I know how wrong that was, Sam. This was too much information to absorb while he was still touching me, while I could still taste him on my lips. This changes everything between us. I hope it does, he said, bringing both hands up to frame my face again. Because I don't want to go back to pretending you're just another employee, Jack. I don't want to go back to professional distance and measured responses and corporate-approved interactions. I looked into his eyes, those hazel eyes I'd observed from across conference tables for 3 years. But never this close. Never with this kind of raw honesty. Sam, if we do this, everything becomes complicated. Office dynamics, our working relationship, company policies, everything. I understand that, he nodded seriously. That's why I'm not accepting your resignation. We'll figure out the professional aspects, HR policies, department restructuring, whatever corporate compliance requires. But Jack, I can't lose you, not professionally, and definitely not personally. He leaned closer again, his lips almost touching mine. Stay tonight, please. Let me show you properly what you mean to me. Let me prove that this isn't just some impulsive reaction to your resignation. I realized I'd already made my decision somewhere between his confession and that kiss. Okay, and just like that, the entire foundation of our relationship shifted completely. Tomorrow would bring complications, awkward conversations, policy reviews, and probably a dozen new problems. But tonight in my apartment with Sam looking at me like I was something precious instead of just another employee, I didn't care about any of that. Tonight I just wanted to see where this led. I know this is incredibly complicated, Sam continued, his thumb still tracing gentle patterns along my jawline. The touch was so soft it was almost reverent, like he was memorizing the shape of my face. I'm your boss. There are company policies, power dynamics, ethical considerations that make this a potential nightmare for both of us. I know this seems completely inappropriate and possibly career-destroying. But Jack, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, intimate and desperate, I can't let you walk away. Not without at least trying to show you what you actually mean to me. Show me how. I asked, though somewhere deep in my chest I already knew where this was heading, could feel it in the way the space between us had become charged with 3 years of unspoken tension. Like this, he said, and then his lips were on mine. It started soft and tentative, like he was asking for permission, testing whether I'd push him away or tell him to stop. His mouth moved against mine carefully, almost hesitantly, as if he couldn't quite believe this was actually happening. But when I responded, because after 3 years of buried attraction and professional frustration, I literally couldn't help myself, everything changed. The kiss became deeper, more urgent, more desperate. His mouth was warm and tasted faintly of the coffee he'd probably been drinking all evening, mixed with something that was purely, distinctly Sam. His hands moved from my face to my waist, pulling me closer against him until there was no space left between our bodies. I realized I was gripping his shirt with both hands, my fingers twisted in the expensive fabric like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. The kiss deepened further, and I could feel 3 years of professional tension and suppressed attraction pouring out of both of us. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, foreheads pressed together, neither of us willing to move away and break whatever spell had fallen over my apartment. Fuck, I whispered, my voice shaky and raw. Sam, what have you just done? Something I've wanted to do for 3 years, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Every morning when you walked into staff meetings with that focused expression, every time you presented solutions that saved the company thousands of dollars, every time you stayed late to perfect a proposal that made me look good in front of the board of directors. Something in his phrasing caught my attention, and I pulled back slightly to look at him properly. Wait, you deliberately didn't give me credit for my work? Sam's expression shifted to something guilty and conflicted. I was protective of your career, but I was also selfishly possessive. I didn't want upper management to notice your talents too much and decide to transfer you to a different department where you'd be working under someone else. I didn't want them to promote you to a position where you wouldn't be reporting directly to me anymore. I know how wrong that was, how it probably damaged your career progression. Sam, this revelation was adding another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. This changes the entire context of our working relationship. I hope it does, he said, bringing both hands up to frame my face again. Because I don't want to go back to pretending you're just another employee I supervise. Jack, I don't want to continue with professional distance and measured corporate responses and carefully managed interactions. I looked into his eyes, those hazel eyes I'd observed from across conference tables for 3 years, but never this close. Never with this kind of raw vulnerability and desperate honesty. Sam, if we cross this line, everything becomes exponentially more complicated. Office dynamics, our working relationship, company policies, potential gossip and speculation from colleagues. Everything changes. I understand the risks, he nodded seriously. That's exactly why I'm not accepting your resignation. We'll figure out the professional complications, HR policies, department restructuring, whatever corporate compliance requires to make this inappropriate. But Jack, his voice became even softer, more vulnerable. I can't lose you, not professionally, and definitely not personally. Not when I've finally found the courage to be honest about what I've been feeling. He leaned closer again, his lips almost touching mine, close enough that I could feel his breath warm against my mouth. Stay tonight, please. Let me show you properly what you mean to me. Beyond just words and confessions. Let me prove that this isn't some impulsive reaction to your resignation, or some panic-driven attempt to keep a valuable employee. The way he said it, not demanding or expecting, but actually asking, actually vulnerable, made something in my chest crack open. This wasn't the authoritative CEO who gave orders and expected compliance. This was just Sam, uncertain and hopeful and more human than I'd ever seen him. I realized that somewhere between his midnight arrival and this moment, I'd already made my decision. Maybe I'd made it 3 years ago when I first started working for him and felt that initial spark of attraction that I'd immediately buried under professional obligations. Maybe I'd made it during all those late nights when we'd worked together on projects and I'd caught glimpses of the real person beneath the corporate facade. Okay, I said simply. The relief that flooded his expression was so intense it almost took my breath away. He looked like I'd just granted him something he'd been desperately hoping for, but never expected to receive. Are you sure? He asked, searching my face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Instead of answering with words, I kissed him again. This time I was the one initiating, pressing my mouth to his with 3 years of suppressed want and professional frustration and confusion about our complicated dynamic. He responded immediately, his arms wrapping around me and pulling me closer until we were pressed together from chest to hip. This kiss was different from the first, less tentative, more certain, filled with the acknowledgement that we were both choosing to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When we finally separated, both of us were breathing hard and looking at each other with a mixture of desire and amazement that this was actually happening. Jack, he said, my name like it was something precious, something he'd been saving up to say properly for years. Don't overthink this. I told him, though my own mind was racing with implications and complications and the dawning realization that my entire life was about to change in ways I couldn't predict. Too late for that, he replied with a small smile, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd seen on his face since he'd arrived at my door. I've been overthinking everything about you for 3 years. And just like that, the entire foundation of our relationship shifted completely and irrevocably. Tomorrow would bring awkward conversations, policy reviews, complicated logistics, and probably a dozen new problems neither of us had anticipated. But tonight, in my apartment with Sam looking at me like I was something infinitely precious instead of just another employee under his supervision, I didn't care about any of that. Tonight, I just wanted to see where this path would lead us. Consequences be damned. The distance between my living room and my bedroom had never seemed so significant, and so utterly irrelevant all at the same time. I woke up the next morning, wrapped in Sam's arms, and for a disorienting moment, I thought the entire previous night had been some elaborate stress-induced dream. Then reality crashed back. We'd spent hours talking, kissing, and carefully exploring this new dynamic between us. Not just physical exploration, though there had been plenty of that, but emotional territory neither of us had ever navigated before. Sam had told me stories about his college years, the crushing family pressure to take over the business after his father's stroke, and how isolating his position as CEO had become over the years. Good morning, his voice came muffled against my hair, rough with sleep and something tender I'd never heard from him before. Morning, I replied, suddenly feeling unexpectedly shy. Everything felt different in daylight, more real, more complicated, more permanent somehow. The professional barriers we'd demolished last night seemed even more significant now that the sun was streaming through my bedroom windows. Any regrets? He asked softly, and I could hear the vulnerability beneath the casual tone, the fear that I might have second thoughts now that we'd had time to process what had happened between us. About last night? Absolutely none. About what happens next? Completely terrified, I admitted honestly. Sam tightened his arms around me, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of my head. We'll figure it out step by step. I've already drafted an email to HR about restructuring your reporting relationship. You'd report to Maya instead of directly to me, which technically removes the direct conflict of interest and makes this ethically appropriate according to company policy. You've already planned everything out? I turned in his arms to face him properly, surprised by how quickly he'd moved into problem-solving mode. Jack, I've been waiting 3 years for this opportunity. I'm not taking any chances that bureaucratic complications or policy violations could derail what we're building here. He brushed a strand of hair away from my forehead with gentle fingers. But if you're not comfortable with the pace or the arrangements, we can take this as slowly as you need. Everything moves at your speed from here. What about the office environments? People are going to notice changes in our dynamic, even if we're trying to be professional. Hopefully not immediately and hopefully not obviously. We'll maintain strictly professional behavior during work hours. No different from how we've always interacted, except he paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, except I'll finally be giving you proper credit for your contributions and innovations. Wow, such a tremendous sacrifice on your part, I teased, and he laughed, a real unguarded laugh that I'd never heard from him in any office context. Before heading to work, we shared coffee in my small kitchen and established basic ground rules for navigating this new reality. Strictly professional behavior during office hours, with no personal conversations unless absolutely urgent. We'd drive separately and arrive at different times to avoid speculation. Most importantly, if either of us felt uncomfortable or overwhelmed by the situation, we'd communicate about it immediately rather than letting problems fester. I'm scared, I admitted as we were both getting ready to leave. So am I, Sam replied seriously. But Jack, whatever this is between us, it's worth the risk and the complications. At least it is to me. When we arrived at the office, separately with a carefully planned 15-minute gap, everything felt surreal and hypercharged. My colleagues' normal morning chatter, the familiar sound of the coffee machine brewing the first pot of the day, Maya discussing her weekend plans with Jake from accounting. Nobody knew that my entire world had fundamentally shifted in the span of 12 hours. I watched Sam through the glass walls of his office. He was already in a meeting with department heads, completely back in his professional mode, serious expression, perfect posture, commanding presence that made it clear why he was successful in his position. For a moment I felt a flicker of doubt. Had last night actually happened? Or had I imagined that vulnerability, that tenderness, that desperate honesty? Then at exactly 11 a.m. I received an email. Your quarterly review has been rescheduled effective immediately. Maya will be conducting it instead of me, and you'll report to her for all project matters going forward. This change reflects departmental restructuring for improved efficiency. 30 seconds later, another email arrived. Lunch? There's a new Mediterranean place that opened near the office. I've heard good things about their menu. Both emails had arrived at the same time, one completely professional and corporate appropriate, the other personal and intimate. This was going to be our new reality. Carefully maintained professional boundaries during work hours, with personal connection reserved for private moments. Maya knocked on my cubicle wall around noon. Hey Jack, can we grab coffee? I want to discuss this reporting change and make sure the transition goes smoothly. Of course, I replied, trying to sound casual while my heart rate spiked. Had she already figured out what was really happening? At the coffee station, Maya lowered her voice. Look, I don't know what's going on between you and Sam, and honestly I don't need to know the details. But I've worked here long enough to recognize when someone's trying to manage potential complications proactively. My stomach dropped. Maya, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything to me, she interrupted gently. What I will say is that you're one of the most talented people in this department, and Sam has been protective of your career trajectory in ways that weren't always obvious. If this reporting change helps both of you navigate whatever personal situation you're dealing with, then I'm happy to facilitate that. I stared at her, processing the implications. You've known about his feeling? I've suspected for a while that his investment in your professional development went beyond normal supervisory interest. The way he personally reviewed your work, how he made sure you were included in high-profile projects, how he got visibly tense when other departments tried to poach you for their teams. Maya stirred her coffee thoughtfully. I just want to make sure you're protected career-wise. Whatever happens personally, your professional reputation shouldn't suffer. Thank you, I said, genuinely grateful for her discretion and support. Just be careful, okay? Office relationships are complicated even under the best circumstances, and when there's a power dynamic involved, things can get messy quickly. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze of normalcy, punctuated by hyper-awareness. Every time Sam passed my desk, every accidental eye contact during meetings, Every moment when our professional masks slipped slightly, it all felt charged with new significance. At 6 p.m., as I was packing up my things, my phone buzzed with a text, "My place or yours? I'll cook dinner." I looked around the nearly empty office, then typed back, "Yours. I want to see where the mysterious Sam Donovan actually lives." His response came immediately, "Fair warning, it's exactly as obsessively organized as you'd expect." As I gathered my belongings and headed for the elevator, I caught sight of Sam through his office window. He was finishing up a phone call, but when he saw me leaving, he gave me the smallest smile, barely noticeable to anyone else, but unmistakably warm and personal. This was our new normal: professional distance during the day, personal connection in the evenings, and the constant navigation of boundaries that felt both necessary and artificial. 2 weeks later, we'd successfully developed a rhythm that was technically appropriate and personally fulfilling in equal measure. Our office interactions were meticulously professional. Meetings, project discussions, presentations with no obvious changes that would raise eyebrows or generate gossip. Maya had been initially surprised by the sudden reporting structure change, but Sam had convinced her it was purely for better departmental distribution of responsibilities and improved workflow efficiency. Our evenings, however, were spent either at my apartment or Sam's house, and I discovered that he was genuinely a completely different person in private settings. He could cook not just basic survival meals, but actually impressive dishes with complex flavors and careful presentation. He told terrible dad jokes that made me groan and laugh. Simultaneously, he managed his anxiety by color-coding his personal schedules and obsessively organizing everything from his closet to his kitchen cabinets. "Have you ever told anyone how much stress you actually carry?" I'd asked one evening, watching him review quarterly projections until nearly midnight, his brow furrowed with concentration and worry. "Being CEO means you can't publicly admit weakness or uncertainty," he'd explained, rubbing his temples. "The board of directors, investors, employees, everyone needs to believe I can confidently handle whatever challenges arise. But with you I can actually breathe properly. Jack, I can let my guard down completely." Today in the office, I'd noticed that Sam seemed generally less tense during meetings. He was actually listening to employee suggestions instead of dismissing them outright, and his responses were more collaborative than dictatorial. Maya had even commented that the overall office atmosphere seemed to be improving, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Jake had obviously sensed that something significant had shifted in the office dynamic, but thankfully he wasn't asking direct questions. Instead, he'd moved into protective friend mode, which was both touching and slightly amusing. "Jack, I don't know what's been happening lately, but you seem different. Happier, more relaxed. And strangely enough, Sam's been less of a demanding perfectionist," Jake had observed during our lunch break. "Whatever changes you've made in your life, they're clearly working well for you." This evening I was at Sam's house for the first time, sprawled comfortably on his couch while a Netflix documentary about marine ecosystems played in the background. His arm was wrapped around my shoulders, and he was absent-mindedly running his fingers through my hair, a gesture that was becoming wonderfully familiar. "Jack?" His voice interrupted my drowsy contentment. "I've been consulting with the legal team about company policies, employee relationships, and full disclosure requirements for executive staff." I immediately became more alert, turning to look at him directly. "And what did they tell you?" "Technically, since you no longer report directly to me, we're not violating any conflict of interest policies. However, if this develops into a serious long-term relationship, we'll need to officially declare it to the board of directors for complete transparency." "What if I'm not ready for that level of public scrutiny and official documentation?" I asked carefully. Sam tilted my chin up so I was looking directly into his eyes. "Then we take this day by day, with no pressure for formal declarations or public announcements. We focus on figuring out our personal dynamic first, and we worry about corporate politics and board approval later. And if the board disapproves when we eventually tell them, then I'll resign from my CEO position," he said simply, as if he was discussing something as mundane as changing his lunch order. "Jack, I've come to understand what success actually means to me now. Professional achievements, profit margins, board approval, all of that becomes meaningless if you're not part of my life." I was genuinely shocked by his casual tone. Sam, you'd leave the company you've built? You'd give up everything you've worked for? I inherited this company from my father after his stroke, Jack. It was never really my choice or my passion. It was family obligation and expectation. But you're something I chose for myself. You're the first decision I've made based purely on what I want, not what's expected of me. The weight of his words settled over me like a warm blanket. For 3 years I'd assumed I was just another employee in his vast corporate machine. Now I was learning that I'd been far more significant to him than I'd ever imagined. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone, I said quietly. I'm not asking you to be responsible for my happiness or my career decisions. He clarified quickly, I'm just telling you that having you in my life, personally, not just professionally, has shown me what I actually value. And it's not quarterly profit reports or board meetings or corporate recognition. I studied his face in the soft lamplight. He looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, even accounting for our new physical intimacy. The constant tension he carried in his shoulders seemed to have eased, and there was something peaceful in his expression that had been completely absent during our 3 years of purely professional interaction. What happens if this doesn't work out? I asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind. What if we try this and discover we're incompatible outside of work? What if the personal relationship complicates our professional effectiveness? Then we'll deal with those complications if and when they arise, he replied. But Jack, I've spent 3 years working closely with you, observing how you think and problem solve and interact with challenges. I've seen you under pressure, when you're frustrated, when you're excited about a breakthrough. I'm not going into this blindly. He shifted position slightly so he could face me more directly. I know you're methodical and thoughtful about major decisions. I know you're fiercely loyal to people you care about. I know you have a terrible habit of working through lunch when you're focused on a project. I know you prefer direct communication over passive-aggressive hints. I know you're funnier than you let most people see, and you're more confident than you realize. You've been paying very close attention, I observed. I've been halfway in love with you for 3 years, Jack. Of course I've been paying attention to everything about you. The casual way he said it, halfway in love, made my breath catch. We hadn't talked about love yet, hadn't defined what we were building beyond acknowledging the mutual attraction and emotional connection. Halfway? I asked softly. Well, now that we're actually doing this, now that I can kiss you and hold you and have real conversations about personal things, I'm rapidly moving toward completely in love, he admitted with a smile that was both vulnerable and confident. I leaned forward and kissed him, soft and slow, tasting the wine we'd shared with dinner and something that was purely Sam. When we separated, I rested my forehead against his. This is going to be complicated, I murmured. Probably, he agreed, but the best things usually are. As I settled back against his side, listening to his steady heartbeat and the distant sound of ocean waves from the documentary, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I felt completely content with where I was and optimistic about where we were heading. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, careful navigation of office politics, and continued adjustment to our new dynamic. But tonight, wrapped in Sam's arms in his perfectly organized living room, everything felt exactly as it should be. Our complicated beginning was evolving into something that felt surprisingly natural and right.